this is how the Brahms Sonata in F minor starts, a bombastic work, one of the pieces in the piano literature that is really a monster, comparable to the Hammerklavier Sonata by Beethoven, maybe the Liszt Sonata that was written in the same year, and some other works of that nature. I'd like to talk today about how to make this Brahms Sonata sound like Brahms compared to any other composer. When we think about the instrument, it is basically a percussive instrument. That's what Stravinsky said. Because after all, a hammer strikes a string and the sound is produced and will die from then on. So how do we create a sound that gives the illusion as if we would be able to play a vibrato, or the sound would start and bloom? Well, one of the tricks would be, first of all, to get away from thinking being a pianist and thinking piano sound, but thinking symphonic music. And this is one of the things that I'd like to emphasize always to young pianists, that don't be a pianist but become an artist and have imagination, and therefore create a sound that gets away from the clinical generic sound production of this instrument. This is a study that takes place for long years and never stops. So playing Brahms means you have to think you are very fat, you are very wide, you are tall, and your fingers and hands are not the typical fingers that can play a little delicate Mozart, but fingers that are a paw. So you create a sound that is really weighty. And you let the arm weight and even the body weight take care of the sound production, rather than trying to be percussive and aggressive to get the forte sounds. In the next little episode, in the opening, we have a total contrast of sound. There's a melody, and there is this very unique pattern in the bass that reminds us of what Beethoven wrote in the Fifth Symphony. It's the same rhythm. Of course, in this case, it's a little slower. And again, when we think about that this piece is a symphony for the piano, we could imagine this might be played by double basses, and maybe there is timpani in the background. And so forth. So here, after this majestic forte beginning, we have to immediately imagine we take the lead away from the arms that we used before, and now we play with very light arms to get that floating sound that is necessary for this section. Again, there is majestic sounds. What we have here is cordial playing, typical homophonic music. I imagine this would be played by maybe trumpets and trombones, and underneath you have as a contrast to that. So we lay our hands into the keys, and underneath we play a different approach. Again, we have a weighty right hand, and we have a more bouncy left hand, played staccato. But we have to preserve the integrity of the left hand sound so that we don't sound mechanical, because we see a forte and we see staccato. I believe that the plain staccato sound on the piano at that speed is very ugly. If you imagine the keyboard would have heated up keys and you're afraid to touch it like on the stove, that gives a very clinical, ugly sound. So here again we have to imagine maybe this is a cello line. It's a sound that has a vibrato built into. So instead of playing with the hot stove technique, you imagine you play with something that has still, even though the notes are detached, you still have a body for each note. Imagine a little halo around it. So the sound stays elastic and never percussive. Let's go over to the second movement. A very lyrical singing melody, very legato, and there's a little breath. So the approach here is to make this as molto legato, legatissimo, as if you want, so that we get away from the feeling, well, there are individual buttons to press, but it becomes a line, like a violinist or a clarinetist would be able to join these individual notes to a line, and there is no air between them. How do we do this on the piano? Well, first of all, we have to connect the notes very well with the fingers. And instead of just connecting them and the hand stays basically fixed on one place, it never sounds musical that way. So when you realize the melody actually starts on top and goes into a valley, you follow that with your hand. So instead of just finger movement, I feel like you are going down and then you go up, and in between, at this place, you take a breath, which means you release the hand from the keys. And that way, with the arm motion, with the elbow and how the wrist prepares the fingers to fall on the right place, you get this idea of a line, in this case the line going downward. And also, because it's marked piano, you shape it so there is actually a built-in decrescendo. So the piano sound at the beginning is not that soft, but so you're at a lower dynamic here, and then you rise to the occasion. If music is supposed to sound relaxed, you physically as a performer, as a pianist, you have to feel relaxed about it. You have to physically be relaxed, I should say. If you're tense about it, hopefully I can control that, and you're not really comfortable in your position, in your shoes, you're not going to sound and produce a relaxed, very beautiful lyrical line of music, because you're too worried about it. This piece, this movement is very, very beautiful, very long, very complex. It has many aspects to it. Pure lento part in this is definitely a conversation between the hands. Instead of thinking that the left hand just accompanies the melody, I feel like there is an echo and I should say a comment to what the right hand plays. It's commented by so you can hear two different people talking to each other, or you can think that this would be two instrumental groups. Maybe, let's say, viola and violin, and then the cello and viola, or another group of instrument could play this. And so on. So a conversation between the two hands, which makes it very, very beautiful and very interesting. Let's go to the very rustic dance that I would call a very typical German waltz. And so on. The tempi in Brahms, I believe, should be always a little bit under what you might think it should be. Brahms, being a very heavy fellow, I think is total contrast to Liszt or Chopin or any composer that likes to write many fiery notes. His music is always weighted. Whatever character it might have, there is always gravity to it, and if one takes these movements a little bit too fast, it loses the very typical ingredient of sounding like Brahms. So if one would play this, it loses what Brahms is all about. It is heavy music. It is a meal with whipped cream and many calories, and still it's very beautiful. It is very nutritious music. So this type of music has to sound a little bit under the speed, and again you will have much more ability as a performer to show the transparency and the multi-layered approach that he has in all his music. There is always more than just melody and accompaniment. There is always harmony that is composed in such an intricate way that we have to look for layers in the music and therefore shape it differently. The trio section of that movement sounds like this. Total contrast to this waltz that is used for the outer sections. So here we have music that is actually very calm, it flows, but it also is homophonic music, meaning you have all these rich chords and tonalities, and you have also a bass line. So again, melody plus a bass line, probably a cello line and double basses in the bass. And here you can imagine maybe not so much string music, but music that is played by the horns and maybe trombones or other woodwind instruments, something that sets up a total contrast to the outer section of that movement. So again, we have to shape our sound differently. The Intermezzo, the fourth movement, is a beauty in itself. Intermezzo actually means an in-between piece, but what Brahms gives here is a little looking back into the mirror. Remember the second movement melody. Here, in this movement, you have the same, almost the same melody, the same idea. But this time it's minor, and it sounds very much like a funeral march to me because of this. Sometimes it is difficult to play the kind of this timpani roll that I envision happens here, to play this, because sometimes the pianists do not respond. So you have to find the right fingering and definitely get this type of vibration. Keep in mind, we are getting back to the motive that we heard already in the first movement. It's a wonderful, imaginative movement. Also very interesting how he ends. make the case that this is symphonic music. This is the best proof. This is not piano music anymore. This is probably flute and oboe. And then maybe cello, viola. A very lonely person telling a very sad story here. And this definitely is not piano music because nobody else writes this, because there are no flashy, typical pianistic elements in this type of music. The finale is a long movement, and the piece, by the way, is over 35 minutes long anyway. So the performer needs a lot of stamina to make it to the finale movement, which in itself is almost a composition that could stand on its own legs. Again, is this piano music? I would say no. It is very much inspired by instrumental sounds, and it is not very typical piano playing. This might be it. This is typical piano music. You have arpeggios, you have something that is fast, because typically piano music needs quick notes. Music that is fast and brilliant and is full of arpeggios and scales and trills. This is what I say is typical piano music. But when you hear this, this is not so pianistic, definitely not in the sense of how Chopin and Liszt and Tchaikovsky and other romantic composers or Mendelssohn would have written. This is the Brahmsian piano music, and this piece therefore has to be approached in a different way, getting away from piano playing and being actually a conductor when you play at the piano, imagining different instruments and therefore finding the right sound and approach to the instrument to get away from anything that sounds remotely percussive.